the war on terror has been used as an excuse to impose all sorts of draconian legislation on the press all over the world. I mean, there's obviously an issue in the Arab region, but also elsewhere, across the United States, for example, my own country in Australia. Governments are using the excuse of national security as a way of limiting the work that journalists are able to do. In Australia, for example, our government, the Australian government, is using national security legislation to track the work that journalists do, to get to journalist sources for the sake of what they say is national security. But what that does, in effect, is that it closes off large parts of the government from the work that journalists are able to do. And so while I know that there is a problem with security and the governments need to take that very seriously, if we go too far, what we're doing is undermining the very thing that makes our societies free and safe and the kind of genuinely democratic places that they are, the places that we want to live in. And press freedom is a really important fundamental part of that. So if we take away press freedom for the sake of some ideal of national security, then I think we're in danger of losing the very thing that makes us free in the first place. I think that there is a global trend towards limiting the press, limiting the work, the scope of the press, towards closing off areas that the press is able to monitor, able to look into. And I think if you look at the trends over the past few years, Freedom House, for example, says that globally the freedom of the press is at its lowest point since records began. And that's a very worrying thing. So I think the trend, if we follow that trend line, then it only looks to be more serious. But I also think that people are becoming a lot more aware of this problem. We're discussing it more and more. People are listening, are holding these kinds of discussions. This meeting itself is a very important part of that. And so I don't think the situation is hopeless, but I do think we can't take it for granted. We cannot take press freedom for granted. Our job has always been to be what I call the awkward squad. We need to be difficult. We need to be asking difficult questions. We need to be looking into things, into places that people might not want us to be looking at, and talking about the difficult subjects. You know, just because governments don't like us to talk about extremism, whether it's fascism or left-wing extremism or religious extremism in any form, if we can't have those discussions, then we've got no way of resolving these kinds of issues, of reaching some kind of social consensus. And so, you know, we have to keep going with those conversations. They've always been necessary. We always have to investigate the work that governments do, and we shouldn't shy away from that. Just because governments don't like it doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. Just because governments are trying to limit what the scope of the work that we do doesn't mean that we should accept that lying down. I'm very worried about the trend towards having in-house journalists relying on either stringers or telephones to reach your sources, or on the news agencies. You know, the agencies do a good job for what they are, but they don't do the kind of analysis, the kind of context that we really need as journalists. The problem at the moment is that with so many sources out there, with so much information, we need good journalism, good first-hand reporting that involves people going out, journalists going out into the field to talk, to understand in a way that you can't possibly do if you're simply sitting in your office on the end of a telephone. I know that work is expensive. I know it's increasingly difficult for news organisations to do that. But I think now more than ever, we need that kind of journalism, and we need to recognise there is a social responsibility to do good journalism, to make sense of what's going on around the world.